This money is fake. The words cut through the grocery store like a blade. Aaliyah Carter stood at the checkout counter, 16 years old, braids pulled back tight, school hoodie zipped halfway. Her hand still hovered where she'd placed the $50 bill, crisp, clean, new from the bank across the street. The cashier held it up to the fluorescent light. Rubbed it between his fingers. His face twisted. "This isn't real," he said again. Louder this time. The line behind her went silent. A woman 2 people back crossed her arms. A man near the drinks aisle slowed his steps. Phones came out. Eyes turned. All on her. Aaliyah's chest tightened, but she kept her face still. Calm. Composed. She'd learned that early. Panic makes people see guilt, even where there's none. "It came from the bank," she said quietly. "First Community. Across the street." The cashier laughed. Not kindly. "Yeah, okay." He slid the bill away from her like it was contaminated. "You're not using this here." The word fake hung in the air like an accusation she couldn't dodge. "Before we go further, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Wherever you are, let me know. Because girls like Aaliyah exist everywhere. And their stories? They deserve to be heard everywhere. So tell me, where are you right now?" The grocery store wasn't special. Just another neighborhood spot where people grabbed milk and bread without thinking. Polished floors. Neat shelves. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. The kind of place you rushed through. In and out. No one expected anything important to happen there. But Aaliyah stood in the middle of it now, small plastic basket at her feet. 2 notebooks. A sandwich. A phone charger. Nothing extravagant. Nothing worth this. Just ordinary purchases for an ordinary Tuesday. Except nothing felt ordinary anymore. The cashier's expression had shifted the moment he touched her money. Subtle at first, a pause, a tightening around his eyes. Then the frown. Then the words. And now everyone was watching. Not to help. To see what would happen. Aaliyah felt the heat crawl up her neck, but her hands stayed steady. Folded together in front of her. Still. She wasn't frozen. She was composed. "There's a difference. Can you test it?" she asked. The cashier scoffed. "I don't need to. I see fake bills all the time." He said it with certainty. Authority. Like he'd already decided who she was. A manager glanced over from another register, slow, uncertain, drawn by the tension but not the truth. Someone whispered behind her. The woman with crossed arms shifted her weight. A phone camera angled toward the counter. Aaliyah looked around the store. No one spoke. No one intervened. They just watched. And in that silence, she felt it, not fear, not anger, but something heavier. Familiar. The weight of being judged before being heard. Of being assumed guilty before proven innocent. Of standing in a public space and suddenly feeling like she didn't belong. Her mother's voice filled her head, steady and sure. Never let them rush you. Never let them shame you. Truth doesn't need volume. Aaliyah's hands trembled once. She folded them tighter to stop it. The cashier pushed the bill further away. "You got anything else to pay with?" She didn't. The transaction total blinked on the screen. The notebook sat on the counter. The sandwich. The charger. Simple things. But they felt miles away now. The manager began walking over, slow steps, careful, like he was approaching something unpredictable. Aaliyah reached into her pocket. Not for another bill. For her phone. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't argue. Didn't beg. She simply said, "I'll call the bank." The cashier shrugged. "Call whoever you want." And in that moment, standing in the middle of a grocery store, surrounded by strangers who'd already made up their minds, Aaliyah Carter made a choice. Not to fight. Not to yell. Not to prove herself to people who'd already decided she was guilty. She chose something quieter. Something stronger. She chose to let truth speak for itself. Her fingers moved across the phone screen, steady and sure. The call connected. And everything was about to change. The phone rang once. Twice. The store felt smaller now. Closer. Like the walls were leaning in. Aaliyah stood off to the side of the register, phone pressed to her ear, backpack still at her feet. The cashier had moved on, started scanning items for the next customer, but his eyes kept flicking back to her. Suspicious. Watchful. Like she might bolt. The woman who'd been two people back in line whispered something to the man beside her. He nodded. Both of them looked at Aaliyah. Not with curiosity. With certainty. They'd already decided. A third ring. Then a voice. "First Community Bank, how can I help you?" Professional. Polite. Unaware. Aaliyah's voice came out steady, measured. "Hi. I just withdrew cash from your branch on Maple Street. I'm at the grocery store across the street, and they're saying my $50 bill is counterfeit." A pause. Not long. But long enough to feel. "Which denomination did you say?" 50. Another pause. Keyboard clicks in the background. "Ma'am, all bills distributed from our branch are machine verified and serial tracked. A counterfeit from our vault isn't possible." Aaliyah didn't smile. Didn't react. Just kept her voice calm. "I'm standing in the store right now. The cashier won't accept it." Silence on the other end. Then movement, a chair scraping, footsteps, urgency bleeding into the tone. "Which store?" "The grocery store. Directly across from your branch." "Stay where you are." The voice shifted, no longer customer service, but authority. Command. "I'm coming over." The line went dead. Aaliyah lowered the phone slowly. The store manager had reached the register now, talking quietly with the cashier. Both of them glanced at her. She didn't look away. Just stood there. Still. Waiting. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone's cartwheel squeaked. The scanner beeped for the next customer, ordinary sounds in an ordinary place. But nothing felt ordinary. The man near the drinks aisle hadn't moved. Still watching. The woman with crossed arms leaned in toward her companion, whispering again. A teenager near the chips pulled out his phone, angling it toward the register. Aaliyah saw it happen in real time, the shift from witnesses to spectators. From people to audience. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing pressing against her skin. But she didn't flinch. Didn't shrink. She'd been here before. Not in this store. Not with this bill. But in this feeling, the one where you're guilty until proven innocent, where your presence is suspicion, where your stillness is mistaken for defiance. Her mother had taught her what to do in moments like this. Don't give them what they expect. Don't give them anger. Don't give them fear. Give them nothing but truth. So Aaliyah stood. And waited. The store manager cleared his throat, walking toward her with careful steps. Mid-40s. Thinning hair. Name tag that read Dennis. "Miss," he said, voice low, conciliatory. "Is there a problem we can help with?" Aaliyah met his eyes. "I called the bank. They're sending someone." Dennis blinked. "The bank?" "The bill came from their vault. It's real." He glanced back at the cashier, then at Aaliyah. His expression was caught between doubt and discomfort, like he wanted to believe her but didn't want to contradict his employee. "We just want to make sure everything's legitimate," Dennis said carefully. Aaliyah nodded once. "So do I." Silence settled between them. The cashier shifted behind the register, arms crossed now. Defensive. The woman in line muttered something about holding everyone up. Another customer sighed audibly. And Aaliyah felt it, the pressure to move, to leave, to make this easier for everyone else. But she didn't. Because leaving would mean accepting the accusation. And she hadn't done anything wrong. 2 minutes passed. The store's background music played something soft and forgettable. The air conditioning kicked on with a low hum. A child somewhere near the back asked their parent for cereal. Normal life continuing around her. But Aaliyah stood in the center of something else, a moment suspended, waiting to tip one way or the other. Dennis shifted his weight. "How long did they say?" "They didn't." He nodded slowly, glancing toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open. An elderly woman with a cane entered, moving toward the pharmacy. Not the bank. Not yet. The teenager with the phone had moved closer now, pretending to browse near the register but clearly recording. Aaliyah saw him in her peripheral vision. She didn't acknowledge it. Didn't turn. Just kept her eyes forward, her breathing steady, her hands folded. The cashier said something under his breath to Dennis. Dennis frowned, shook his head slightly. More waiting. More eyes. More silence that felt heavier than sound. And then, the automatic doors slid open again. Hard this time. Fast. A man in a dark blazer strode through, scanning the store with sharp, urgent eyes. His tie was slightly crooked. His breath rushed. His steps purposeful. He spotted Aaliyah immediately. Crossed the floor in 4 long strides. "Are you Aaliyah Carter?" She nodded. His voice carried, clear, firm, leaving no room for doubt. "I'm Mr. Reynolds. Branch manager at First Community." He turned toward the register. Toward the cashier. Toward everyone watching. "That $50 bill is real." Before Mr. Reynolds arrived, before the doors opened and everything shifted, Aaliyah stood alone. 16 years old. No allies. No one stepping forward to say, "Wait, maybe she's telling the truth." Just a girl at a checkout counter, holding a phone, surrounded by adults who'd already made up their minds. The cashier had been confident. Certain. He'd held that bill up like evidence, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "This is fake." Not "I think this might be fake." Not "let me double check." Just certainty. Authority. Judgment. And Aaliyah, quiet, composed, patient, had become the problem. Not the accusation. Her. That's how it works sometimes. The imbalance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent. Structural. Built into the moment itself. An adult in uniform behind a register. A teenager in a hoodie with a backpack. One voice amplified by position. One voice that has to fight just to be heard. Dennis, the store manager, had approached her with caution, like she was the unpredictable element, not the false accusation hanging in the air. "Is there a problem we can help with?" he'd asked. As if the problem was hers to solve. As if she'd brought this on herself. Aaliyah had kept her voice steady. Explained calmly. Offered verification. But she'd seen the hesitation in his eyes. The doubt. The unspoken question, why would a teenager have a crisp $50 bill? As if money had an age requirement. As if legitimacy could be measured by how someone looked. The woman in line, the one who'd crossed her arms and whispered, hadn't questioned the cashier's judgment. She'd questioned Aaliyah's presence. The man near the drinks aisle hadn't wondered if maybe the cashier was wrong. He'd wondered what Aaliyah was trying to pull. The teenager recording on his phone wasn't capturing injustice. He was capturing content. A moment to share. A story with a villain already cast. And Aaliyah had felt it, the invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. The expectation that she prove herself. The assumption that she didn't belong. The quiet, pervasive belief that guilt was more likely than innocence. She could have yelled. Could have demanded to speak to someone higher. Could have made a scene. But she knew better. Loud black girls get labeled aggressive. Calm black girls get labeled suspicious. There's no winning position when the game's already rigged. So she'd done the only thing that made sense. She'd called the bank. Not because she expected them to care. But because truth, real, documented, verifiable truth, was the only weapon she had. Standing there, waiting for Mr. Reynolds to arrive, Aaliyah had counted the seconds. 143 of them. 2 minutes and 23 seconds where she stood in public view, accused and isolated, while strangers watched and judged. No one asked her name. No one asked if she was okay. No one said, "Hey, maybe we should actually check before assuming." They just watched. And waited. And let her stand there, alone, carrying the weight of an accusation she didn't deserve. The cashier had pushed her bill to the far edge of the counter. Away from him. Away from the register. Like it was evidence in a crime. Her items, notebooks, sandwich, charger, sat there too. Unbagged. Unpurchased. Suspended in limbo. Aaliyah had stared at them. Simple things. Things she'd saved up her allowance for. Things she needed. And now they felt like proof of something shameful. Dennis had glanced at the entrance multiple times. Nervous. Uncertain. The cashier had started helping the next customer, but his attention kept snapping back to Aaliyah. Watching her. Guarding against whatever he thought she might do. Run, maybe. 'Cause a scene. Prove him right. But Aaliyah didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood in the space they'd put her in, the space between accusation and vindication, and waited for truth to show up. Because that's the thing about imbalance. It doesn't care about your composure. It doesn't care about your dignity. It doesn't care that you did everything right. It just exists. Heavy and structural and exhausting. And all you can do is stand in it. Refuse to buckle. And wait for the moment when the balance finally tips. That moment was coming. Aaliyah could feel it in the air, something shifting, moving, building toward revelation. The doors would open soon. Mr. Reynolds would walk through. And everyone watching would have to reconsider. But until then, she stood alone. A girl with a phone and a truth no one wanted to believe. And she stood perfectly still. The phone call had been simple. No drama. No raised voice. Just facts. Aaliyah had dialed the number printed on the receipt still folded in her pocket, The one from 30 minutes ago when she'd walked into First Community Bank and withdrawn $60. 3 20s. She'd asked the teller to swap 120 for a 50 and a 10. The teller had smiled. Said sure. Counted it out. Aaliyah had folded the bills carefully, tucked them in her pocket, and crossed the street. Normal. Easy. Unremarkable. Until it wasn't. Now, standing in the grocery store with her phone pressed to her ear, she'd spoken with the same calm precision she'd used at the register. I withdrew cash from your branch 30 minutes ago. I'm at the store across the street. They're saying my $50 bill is counterfeit. The bank representative had paused, not suspicious of Aaliyah, but confused by the claim itself. Which bill? 50. Ma'am, that's not possible. All our bills are machine verified before distribution. There's serial tracked through our system. Aaliyah hadn't argued. Hadn't insisted. Just stated facts. I'm standing in the grocery store right now. The cashier won't accept it. That's when the tone had changed. The representative had asked which store. Asked her to stay put. Then said, I'm coming over. Not someone will come. I'm coming. First person. Immediate. That's when Aaliyah knew. The bank knew their money was real. And they weren't going to let their reputation, or hers, be questioned without response. The call had lasted 47 seconds. Short. Direct. Effective. Aaliyah had lowered the phone and looked at Dennis, the store manager. They're sending someone, she'd said quietly. Dennis had nodded, but his expression was still uncertain. Still caught between his employee's confidence and this teenage girl's calm insistence. He hadn't apologized. Hadn't said, we should have checked. Just nodded and waited. The cashier had kept working, scanning items for the next customer with exaggerated focus. But his jaw was tight. His movements sharp. He knew something had shifted. Aaliyah had stepped to the side, out of the way but still visible. Still present. She hadn't left. Hadn't backed down. Hadn't given them an easy out. Because leaving would have meant accepting blame. And she wasn't guilty. The woman who'd been whispering earlier had finished her transaction and left, quickly, eyes down, avoiding Aaliyah's gaze. The man near the drinks had finally moved, grabbing a soda and heading toward another register. The teenager with the phone was still there, though. Still recording. Still waiting for something dramatic to happen. But Aaliyah didn't give him drama. She gave him patience. Stillness. The kind of quiet strength that doesn't make good viral content but makes unshakable character. Her mother had taught her this. When people want you to react, don't. When they want you to shrink, stand. When they want you to prove yourself, let truth do the work. So Aaliyah had stood there, backpack at her feet, phone in her hand, eyes forward, and waited. Not anxiously. Not desperately. Just waited. Because she knew something the cashier didn't. Something Dennis didn't. Something the watching crowd didn't. She knew she was right. And right doesn't need performance. It just needs time. The store's background music shifted to something instrumental and bland. The air conditioning hummed. A cart rattled past. Normal sounds. Normal life. But Aaliyah existed in a separate space, a pocket of tension and anticipation where every second stretched longer than it should. She counted them silently. 1, 2, 3. 60 seconds became 90. 90 became 120. Her phone screen went dark in her hand. She didn't check it. Didn't refresh anything. Just held it loosely, ready. Dennis shifted his weight, glanced toward the entrance for the fourth time. The cashier finished with his customer, and for a brief moment, the register was empty. Quiet. He looked at Aaliyah. She looked back. No words. Just a moment of acknowledgement, two people on opposite sides of an accusation, waiting to see who'd been right. His expression was harder now. Defensive. Hers was calm. Not smug. Not angry. Just certain. And then, movement at the entrance. The automatic doors slid open. A man in a blazer, dark, professional, stepped through with purpose. His eyes scanned the store quickly, efficiently, landing on Aaliyah almost immediately. He walked toward her like he knew exactly where he was going. Like he'd already decided what needed to happen. Aaliyah straightened slightly. Not nervous. Ready. The man reached her in seconds. Are you Aaliyah Carter? Yes. He extended his hand. She shook it. I'm Mr. Reynolds. Branch manager. Then he turned toward the register. Toward the cashier. Toward Dennis. And his voice, clear, firm, leaving no room for misinterpretation, filled the space. That $50 bill is real. The store held its breath. Mr. Reynolds stood between Aaliyah and the register, his presence immediate and undeniable. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just certain. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing facts, not assumptions. That $50 bill, he repeated, came from our vault this morning. Serial number B47382916K. Dispensed at 2:47 p.m. to Ms. Carter here. He pulled a small notepad from his blazer pocket, flipped it open. We track every bill over $20. Machine verified. Documented. There's no possibility, none, that it's counterfeit. Dennis, the store manager, blinked. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The cashier's face flushed, neck first, then cheeks. The teenager with the phone angled closer, still recording. Mr. Reynolds turned to Aaliyah. May I see the bill? She gestured toward the register. He has it. Mr. Reynolds looked at the cashier. Didn't ask. Just extended his hand. The cashier hesitated, 1 second, 2, then picked up the 50 from where he'd pushed it to the edge of the counter. Handed it over. Carefully now. Differently. Mr. Reynolds examined it briefly. Turned it over. Held it to the light. Not because he doubted it. Because he wanted everyone to see him verify it. Authentic, he said simply. Then he handed it back to Aaliyah. Your money, Ms. Carter. She took it, folded it once, and placed it back on the counter. Ready to complete her purchase. The store's silence shifted, no longer tense with accusation, but thick with recalibration. Eyes that had watched her with suspicion now looked uncertain. The woman who'd whispered earlier was gone. The man from the drinks aisle had disappeared. But others remained. Watching. Reconsidering. Dennis cleared his throat. We appreciate you coming over, Mr. Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds nodded once. Professional. Our customer's integrity is our responsibility. When it's questioned unjustly, we respond. He didn't say it loudly. Didn't grandstand. But the weight of those words, unjustly, settled over the space like a verdict. The cashier shifted behind the register, eyes down now. Not meeting anyone's gaze. Not apologizing. Just standing there, caught between what he'd claimed and what was true. Dennis looked at Aaliyah. Miss Carter, we're very sorry for the confusion. Aaliyah nodded slowly. Didn't smile. Didn't accept the apology with eagerness. Just acknowledged it. Because confusion wasn't the right word. It hadn't been confusion. It had been assumption. Accusation. Judgment without verification. But she didn't correct him. Didn't need to. The truth had already done that. Mr. Reynolds placed a business card on the counter beside her bill. If you ever need anything from the bank, Ms. Carter, you ask for me directly. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded once more, then turned toward the exit. Paused. Looked back at Dennis and the cashier. Next time, he said, voice even, verify before you accuse. Then he left. The automatic doors slid shut behind him. And the store, still silent, had to sit with what remained. Aaliyah stood at the register, her bill on the counter, her items waiting. Dennis gestured to the cashier. Ring her up. The cashier's hands moved slowly. Picked up the bill. Held it now like it mattered. Like it was real. Because it was. It always had been. The scanner beeped. The register opened. Change was counted. A receipt printed. All the normal sounds of a transaction. But nothing felt normal. Because everyone in that store, everyone who'd watched, who'd judged, who'd assumed, had just learned something. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But clearly. They'd learned that the girl they doubted had been right all along. And the authority they'd trusted had been wrong. The teenager with the phone lowered it slowly, thumb hovering over the screen. Whatever video he'd been hoping for, drama, conflict, escalation, hadn't happened. Just truth. Quiet and undeniable. Aaliyah took her change, her receipt, her bagged items. And before she turned to leave, she looked at the cashier. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Just with something steady and sure. You could have checked, she said softly. He didn't respond. Didn't look up. Just stood there, holding the register drawer, face still flushed. Aaliyah picked up her bag and walked toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open. And she stepped out into the afternoon light, clean, clear, and honest. Free. The moment Mr. Reynolds entered the store, everything tilted. Not slowly. Not subtly. Instantly. The automatic doors had slid open with force, faster than usual, propelled by his urgency. He'd stepped through like someone entering a scene already in progress, already knowing his role. His blazer was dark, professional. His tie slightly crooked, evidence of speed, not carelessness. His breath came quick but controlled. And his eyes, sharp, focused, had scanned the entire store in 2 seconds. Found Aaliyah. Locked on. He crossed the polished floor in 4 long strides, each step deliberate and purposeful. The few remaining customers turned to watch. Dennis straightened. The cashier's hands stilled on the register. And Aaliyah, standing off to the side with her phone still in her hand, felt something shift in her chest. Not relief yet. But recognition. Someone had come. Someone believed her. Mr. Reynolds reached her quickly, but he didn't rush the words. Didn't perform. Are you Aaliyah Carter? Yes. His handshake was firm. Brief. Professional. I'm Mr. Reynolds. Branch manager at First Community Bank. Then he turned. Faced the register. Faced Dennis. Faced the cashier who'd started this. And his voice, calm, clear, absolutely certain, filled every corner of the store. That $50 bill is real. Not I think. Not it should be. Is. Present tense. Definitive. Unarguable. The cashier's face changed, color draining first, then rushing back in a flush that started at his collar and climbed to his cheeks. Dennis opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Mr. Reynolds, we were just... That bill, Mr. Reynolds continued, pulling a small notepad from his pocket, was dispensed from our vault this morning at 2:47 p.m. Serial number B47382916K. Machine verified. Tracked through our system. There is zero possibility it's counterfeit. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. Authority doesn't require volume. The teenager with the phone had stopped recording, thumb frozen over the screen. A woman near the pharmacy slowed her steps, listening. An older man by the produce section turned fully around. The store, which had been filled with suspicious eyes and whispered judgments just minutes before, was now completely silent. Watching. Waiting. Witnessing a different story than the one they'd assumed. Mr. Reynolds looked at the cashier directly. May I see the bill? Not a question. A directive. The cashier reached for it slowly, the 50 he'd pushed to the far edge of the counter like contaminated evidence. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. He handed it to Mr. Reynolds. Carefully. Respectfully. The way he should have handled it from the beginning. Mr. Reynolds took it, held it up to the fluorescent light. Tilted it. Examined the security strip, the watermark, the microprinting. Everyone watched. Not because they understood what he was looking for, but because his confidence made them believe he knew exactly what he was seeing. After 10 seconds, long enough to be thorough, short enough to be certain, he lowered the bill. Authentic, he said simply. Then he handed it directly to Aaliyah. Not to the cashier. Not to Dennis. To her. Your money, Miss Carter. She took it, and something in her chest loosened, not relief exactly, but validation. The weight she'd been carrying for the past 5 minutes, the burden of proof that should never have been hers, lifted. She folded the bill once and placed it back on the counter. Ready to complete what should have been a simple transaction. Mr. Reynolds turned to Dennis. Our customer's integrity is our responsibility. When it's questioned without cause, we respond immediately. Dennis nodded quickly. Too quickly. Of course. We appreciate you coming over. This young woman, Mr. Reynolds continued, gesturing toward Aaliyah, withdrew cash from our branch 30 minutes ago. She has done nothing wrong. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that warranted accusation. The words landed heavy. Purposeful. Unavoidable. The cashier's jaw tightened. His eyes stayed fixed on the register screen. We train our staff to verify bills when there's genuine cause for concern, Mr. Reynolds said. But verification requires testing. Not assumption. Still calm. Still measured. But the criticism was clear. Dennis shifted his weight. I understand. We'll review our procedures. Mr. Reynolds nodded once. Then he looked at Aaliyah, and his expression softened, not with pity, but with respect. I'm very sorry this happened, he said quietly. It shouldn't have. Aaliyah met his eyes. Thank you for coming. Always. He pulled a business card from his wallet, placed it on the counter beside her money. If you ever need anything from the bank, anything at all, you come straight to me. She picked up the card, read the name embossed in raised letters, David Reynolds, branch manager. Thank you, she said again. He nodded, then turned back toward the exit. paused at the door. Looked back at Dennis and the cashier one more time. "Next time," he said, voice carrying across the store, "verify before you accuse." Then he left. The doors slid shut behind him with a soft hiss. And the store, still silent, still processing, had to sit with what had just happened. The teenager with the phone lowered it completely now, staring at the screen like he wasn't sure what he'd captured. The woman near the pharmacy turned away, resuming her shopping. The older man by produce shook his head slowly and walked toward the registers. And Aaliyah stood at the counter, her bill waiting, her dignity restored. Not by her own defense. Not by raised voices or dramatic confrontation. But by truth. Documented. Verified. Undeniable. Dennis gestured to the cashier. "Complete the transaction." The cashier's hands moved mechanically. Picked up the 50. Held it now with a carefulness that felt like an apology he couldn't voice. Scanned her items. Opened the register. Counted change. All the motions of normalcy. But everyone knew nothing about this had been normal. The receipt printed. He tore it off, placed it in the bag with her notebooks and sandwich and charger. Handed it to her without meeting her eyes. Aaliyah took the bag. And before she turned to leave, before she walked out of this store and back into her ordinary life, she looked at him. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Just with quiet, undeniable clarity. "You could have checked," she said. Soft. Simple. True. Then she turned. Walked toward the doors. And stepped out into the afternoon, vindicated, dignified, and free. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter. Cleaner. Honest. Aaliyah stood on the sidewalk for a moment, bag in hand, afternoon sun warm on her face. The grocery store's automatic doors slid shut behind her, final and complete. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. The moment had already written itself. Not with noise. Not with drama. Not with the theatrical confrontation people expected when they heard stories about injustice. Just truth, quietly delivered. Authority, calmly transferred. Dignity, restored without spectacle. Aaliyah shifted her backpack higher on her shoulder and started walking. The bank was across the street, First Community, where this had all started 30 minutes ago. Mr. Reynolds had probably already returned to his office, back to his normal Tuesday afternoon. But for him, this hadn't been normal either. He'd stopped what he was doing. Left his desk. Crossed the street. For her. For truth. For the principle that a customer's integrity mattered. Aaliyah had lived 16 years learning to expect the opposite, that people in positions of power rarely left their comfortable spaces to defend someone like her. But Mr. Reynolds had. And that mattered. She reached the corner, waited for the light. A car passed. Then another. Ordinary traffic on an ordinary day. But Aaliyah felt different. Not louder. Not harder. Stronger. Calmer. Like something inside her had solidified, a quiet certainty about who she was and what she deserved. The light changed. She crossed. Behind her, the grocery store continued its day. Customers came and went. Registers beeped. Carts rolled. Life moved forward like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Not just to Aaliyah. To everyone who'd witnessed it. The cashier would go home tonight carrying the weight of what he'd done, the assumption he'd made, the accusation he'd voiced, the humiliation of being corrected. Maybe he'd learn from it. Maybe he wouldn't. But he'd remember. Dennis would review the store's procedures, probably add some training about bill verification, cover the company's liability. But he'd also remember the moment when his employees' certainty crumbled in front of paying customers. The teenager with the phone would watch his video later, if he even kept it, and see something different than what he'd expected to capture. Not viral drama. Just a girl standing still while truth arrived on its own. And the other customers, the woman who'd whispered, the man who'd watched, the ones who'd pulled out phones and crossed arms and made assumptions, they'd carry it too. The discomfort of realizing they'd been wrong. The quiet shame of having judged too quickly. The lesson that composure doesn't mean guilt, and stillness doesn't mean submission. Aaliyah reached the other side of the street. Kept walking. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably her mom, checking in about dinner or homework or whether she'd picked up what they needed. Normal life resuming. She'd tell her mother about this later. Maybe. Or maybe she'd keep it to herself for a while, let it settle, figure out what it meant before sharing it. But she already knew one thing. She hadn't needed to prove who she was. She just needed to refuse to accept who they assumed she was. And sometimes, that's all justice requires. Not a fight. Not a scene. Not a crowd cheering or cameras rolling or some dramatic moment of vindication. Just a person standing firm in their truth and letting the world catch up. Aaliyah turned onto her street. Familiar houses. Familiar trees. Familiar sidewalk cracks she'd memorized years ago. Home was 3 blocks away. She walked steadily, bag swinging slightly with each step. The notebooks inside would fill with homework tonight. The sandwich would be tomorrow's lunch. The charger would keep her phone alive through another week of texts and calls and ordinary teenage life. Simple things. But she'd fought for them today. Quietly. Without raising her voice or losing her composure or giving anyone ammunition to call her aggressive or difficult or wrong. She just stood. And waited. And let truth speak. That's power too. Not the kind that gets celebrated. Not the kind that makes headlines or goes viral or becomes a story people share. But the kind that changes you from the inside. The kind that teaches you that your worth isn't determined by who believes you, but by what's actually true. Aaliyah reached her front door, pulled out her keys. The house was quiet, her mom probably still at work, her little brother at after-school program. She'd have the place to herself for another hour. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, dropped her backpack by the stairs. Carried her grocery bag to the kitchen. Unpacked the items one by one. Notebooks on the counter. Sandwich in the fridge. Charger plugged into the outlet by the table. All exactly where they belonged. Normal. Easy. Right. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, hands resting on the counter, breathing steady. Outside, the world continued. Inside, something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not obviously. But deeply. Aaliyah had walked into a store as one version of herself and walked out as another, not different in appearance or circumstances, but different in certainty. She knew now what she'd always suspected. That composure is a form of resistance. That patience is a kind of power. That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to be moved by other people's assumptions. Stand still. Tell truth. Wait. And eventually, the world will adjust itself around you. Not because you demanded it, but because truth has weight. And dignity has gravity. And justice, real justice, doesn't need volume. It just needs someone willing to stand in it. Quietly. Firmly. Without apology. Aaliyah picked up her phone, finally checked the message. Her mom, need anything from the store? She smiled slightly. Typed back, already got it. Then she put the phone down, pulled out her homework, and got back to her ordinary life. Stronger for what she'd endured. Calmer for how she'd survived it. And certain, absolutely certain, that she'd done nothing wrong. Ever. That certainty would carry her forward. Through other moments of doubt. Other accusations. Other times when the world tried to make her small. But she'd remember this. The grocery store. The $50 bill. The bank manager who showed up. And the quiet power of standing still while truth arrived on its own. That's the kind of justice that lasts. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just true. That evening, Aaliyah sat cross-legged on her bed, notebook open, pen moving across lined paper. Algebra homework. Question 7, solve for X. Her phone sat beside her, face down and silent. The charger, the one from the store, was plugged into the wall, cord stretching across her nightstand. The sandwich she'd bought sat wrapped in her lunch bag for tomorrow. Everything exactly as it should be. Normal. Ordinary. Unremarkable. But Aaliyah didn't feel ordinary. She felt different, not in a way she could name yet, but in a way she could sense. Like something had shifted beneath the surface, rearranging itself into a new shape. Stronger. Clearer. More certain. She told her mother about the store when she got home, simple facts, no embellishment. They said my money was fake. I called the bank. The manager came and verified it. Her mother had stopped chopping vegetables, knife hovering midair. Did they apologize? The store manager did. The cashier? Aaliyah shook her head. Her mother's jaw had tightened, but she didn't explode. Didn't grab her keys and storm to the store. Didn't demand phone numbers or threaten complaints. She just looked at Aaliyah with something heavy and familiar in her eyes. Did you keep your composure? Yes. Did you tell the truth? Yes. Did it work? Aaliyah nodded. Her mother had set the knife down, crossed the kitchen, and pulled her into a hug, tight and wordless and full of things that didn't need saying. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry you had to go through that. This won't be the last time. But you handled it perfectly. All of it communicated in pressure and silence. When her mother finally pulled back, she'd cupped Aaliyah's face in both hands. You did good, baby. You did real good. Now, alone in her room, Aaliyah stared at the algebra problem. Solve for X. Find the unknown. Balance the equation. Life felt like that sometimes, trying to solve for variables you didn't choose, trying to find balance in situations that started off unequal. She wrote the formula. Worked through the steps. Isolated the variable. Simplified. Solved. X equals 4. Simple. Logical. Clear. If only real life worked that cleanly. But today had worked. Not because she'd fought loudly or argued passionately or demanded justice with raised fists. But because she'd done something harder. She'd stood still. Refused to panic. Refused to perform. Refused to give them the reaction they expected. And she'd let truth do the work. That was the lesson her mother had been teaching her for years, the one Aaliyah was finally starting to understand. Composure isn't weakness. Patience isn't passivity. Calm isn't compliance. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply not break. Not flinch. Not fold. Just stand in your truth and wait for the world to catch up. Aaliyah moved to the next problem. Question 8. If y equals 3, solve for z. Her pen scratched across paper, working through the equation methodically. Outside her window, the neighborhood settled into evening. Street lights flickered on. Cars pulled into driveways. Doors closed. Families gathered around dinner tables. Ordinary life. But Aaliyah knew now, had always known, really, that ordinary life for her required extraordinary patience. That she'd be questioned when others wouldn't be. That she'd be doubted when others would be believed. That she'd have to verify her legitimacy over and over in situations where others' legitimacy was simply assumed. That was the cost of existing in a world that had already made up its mind about girls who looked like her. Black. Young. Female. 3 variables that intersected to create automatic suspicion in spaces where she should have been able to move freely. But today she'd proven something. Not to them. To herself. She could navigate that suspicion without losing herself. Could stand in accusation without accepting guilt. Could face injustice without becoming loud or bitter or hard. She could be exactly who she was, calm, composed, dignified, and still win. Not by fighting their fight, but by refusing to play their game. Aaliyah finished question 8, moved to question 9. The homework felt meditative now. Soothing. Each problem had a solution. Each equation could be balanced. Not like life, but close enough. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, a text from her best friend Maya. "You good? Heard something happened at the store." Aaliyah smiled slightly. News traveled fast in their neighborhood. She typed back, "I'm good. Tell you tomorrow." Maya responded immediately, "You sure?" "Yeah. I handled it. That's my girl Flex Biceps." Aaliyah set the phone down again, returned to her homework. But Maya's words lingered. "That's my girl." Simple. Affirming. Exactly what she needed. Because today hadn't just been about a $50 bill or a false accusation or a bank manager showing up. It had been about something bigger. About learning who she was when the world tried to tell her she was something else. About discovering that her mother's lessons, the ones about composure and dignity and quiet strength, actually worked. About realizing that she didn't need anyone's permission to exist authentically. She just needed to stand firm in her truth and let everything else sort itself out. Aaliyah closed her notebook, stacked it neatly with her textbooks. Tomorrow she'd go back to school. Back to classes and friends and regular teenage problems. The grocery store incident would fade into memory. People would stop talking about it. Life would move on. But she'd carry something forward. A certainty. A strength. A quiet, unshakable knowledge that she could handle whatever came next. Not because she was loud. Not because she was aggressive. Not because she demanded attention. But because she was solid. Grounded. True. And truth, real, honest truth, doesn't need defense. It just needs presence. Aaliyah turned off her desk lamp, leaving just the soft glow of her bedside light. She pulled out her phone one more time, scrolled through messages and notifications without really reading them. Then she opened her notes app and typed something, not for homework, not for school, just for herself. A reminder. A promise. Today I learned, composure is power. Silence is strategy. Truth doesn't need volume. And I am exactly enough, exactly as I am. She read it once. Twice. Then locked her phone and set it aside. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges. Its own moments of doubt. its own tests. But tonight, Aaliyah Carter went to sleep knowing something she hadn't known that morning. She was stronger than she'd realized, calmer than anyone expected, and capable of standing firm in spaces that wanted her to shrink. That knowledge would carry her forward, through grocery stores and classrooms and every other place that tried to question her legitimacy. And she'd face them all the same way. Quietly. Firmly. Without apology. Just truth. Simple and undeniable. That was enough. She was enough. Always had been. The story of what happened at the grocery store didn't end when Aaliyah walked out the door. It continued in the minds of everyone who'd witnessed it. The cashier went home that night and couldn't shake the weight of his mistake. Not because he'd been punished or fired or publicly shamed, but because he'd been wrong. Confidently, publicly wrong. And a 16-year-old girl had been right. That reversal, that inversion of authority, sat heavy in his chest. He'd tell himself later that he was just doing his job. That he saw fake bills all the time. That he had reason to be suspicious. But deep down, he'd know. He hadn't verified. He'd assumed. And his assumption had been about more than just money. Dennis, the store manager, would add a training module about bill verification. Would send a memo to all staff about proper procedures. Would tell himself that the situation had been handled appropriately, professionally, without escalation. But he'd also remember the moment when a bank manager had walked into his store and corrected his employee in front of customers. When authority had shifted. When power had revealed itself to be about truth, not position. The teenager with the phone would watch his video once, maybe twice, then delete it. Because what he'd captured wasn't what he'd wanted. It wasn't dramatic. Wasn't viral-worthy. Wasn't the kind of content that racks up views and comments. It was just real. A girl standing quietly while adults fumbled around her. Truth arriving without fanfare. Justice delivered without spectacle. Not interesting enough for the algorithm, but profound enough to remember. And the other customers, the woman who'd whispered, the man who'd watched, the ones who'd pulled out phones and made assumptions, they'd carry it differently. Some would forget by morning. Some would rationalize what they'd seen. But some would pause the next time they witnessed a confrontation in a public space. Would ask themselves, do I actually know what's happening here? Or am I just assuming? That pause, that moment of uncertainty before judgment, that's where change begins. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But quietly, in the space between assumption and verification. Aaliyah had created that space. Not by arguing or fighting or demanding attention, but by simply refusing to accept guilt she didn't deserve. By standing firm. By calling the bank. By waiting for truth to arrive on its own. That's the lesson people miss about justice. They think it requires noise. Volume. Drama. They think you have to fight for every inch, demand every right, make every moment a spectacle. But sometimes, often, justice is quieter than that. Sometimes it's just a girl standing still while the world sorts itself out around her. Sometimes it's just patience outlasting assumption. Sometimes it's just composure revealing itself to be stronger than certainty. Aaliyah had learned that today. Not theoretically. Not as an abstract concept in her mother's lessons. But practically. In real time. In a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd learned that dignity doesn't need defense. That truth doesn't require performance. That power, real power, isn't about who's loudest or most aggressive or most demanding. It's about who can stand firm when everything around them is shifting. Who can maintain composure when the world expects breakdown? Who can wait for truth without anxiety or desperation? That's power. Not the kind that gets celebrated. Not the kind that makes headlines. But the kind that changes you from the inside out. The kind that teaches you who you are when pressure arrives. The kind that shows you what you're capable of enduring. Aaliyah had discovered that about herself today. And she'd carry it forward. Into classrooms where teachers doubted her intelligence. Into stores where employees watched her with suspicion. Into spaces where her presence was questioned before it was accepted. She'd carry the knowledge that she could handle it. Not by fighting every battle. Not by proving herself to every doubter. But by simply being exactly who she was, calm, composed, truthful, and letting the world adjust around her. That's the lesson. Not just for Aaliyah. For everyone watching. For every girl who's been questioned, doubted, assumed guilty. For every person who's had to verify their legitimacy in spaces where others' legitimacy is simply granted. For every black girl who's learned too young that composure is survival. That patience is strategy. That silence, chosen, deliberate silence, is sometimes the most powerful response. Aaliyah's story wasn't unique. Girls like her faced moments like this every day. In stores and schools and streets and spaces where they should have been able to exist freely. But they didn't. They existed carefully. Deliberately. With constant awareness that their every move was being watched, interpreted, judged. That's the reality. And it's exhausting. But what Aaliyah proved today, what she'd proven to herself more than anyone, is that you can navigate that reality without losing yourself. You can be questioned without accepting guilt. You can be doubted without internalizing shame. You can stand in accusation and emerge with dignity intact. Because truth has weight. And composure has power. And justice, real, honest justice, doesn't require volume. It just requires someone willing to stand still long enough for it to arrive. Aaliyah was that someone today. And she'd be that someone again. Tomorrow. Next week. Next year. Every time the world tried to make her small, she'd remember this moment. The grocery store. The $50 bill. The bank manager who showed up. And the quiet certainty that she'd done nothing wrong. That knowledge would carry her through everything that came next. Not as armor. Not as weapon. But as foundation. Solid. Unshakable. True. And that's the lesson. Not just for her. For all of us. That dignity doesn't need defense. That truth doesn't need volume. That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply stand firm in who you are and let the world catch up. Quietly. Patiently. Without apology. That's justice. Real justice. The kind that lasts. 3 weeks later, Aaliyah walked past that same grocery store. Different day. Different time. Different reason. She was heading to the library, backpack slung over one shoulder, headphones in her ears. The store's automatic doors slid open as someone exited, a woman with 2 bags of groceries, talking on her phone. Normal. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Aaliyah glanced inside briefly, just a quick look, and saw the same registers, the same fluorescent lights, the same polished floors. The cashier wasn't working. Someone else stood behind the counter now. The store had moved on. Life had moved on. But Aaliyah carried something forward. Not resentment. Not bitterness. Not the need to avoid that place or the people in it. Just knowledge. Clear, certain, unshakable knowledge. She kept walking. Past the store. Past the bank. Past the intersection where she'd stood 3 weeks ago with a grocery bag in hand and newly restored dignity in her chest. The memory was still there, vivid and complete, but it had settled into something different now. Not trauma. Lesson. Not wound. Wisdom. She'd learned what she was capable of enduring. What she was capable of surviving. What she was capable of becoming in moments when the world tried to define her as something less than she was. And she'd learned she was enough. Had always been enough. Would always be enough. Exactly as she was. That certainty changed everything. Not loudly. Not obviously. But deeply, fundamentally, permanently. Aaliyah reached the library, climbed the steps, pulled open the heavy door. Inside, it was quiet. Peaceful. Full of books and stories and voices from people who'd lived and learned and grown. She found a table near the window, unpacked her homework, settled in. Normal afternoon. Normal work. Normal life. But she wasn't the same girl who'd walked into a grocery store 3 weeks ago with 2 notebooks and a $50 bill. She was stronger now. Calmer. More certain of who she was and what she deserved. And that strength, that calm, quiet certainty, would carry her through everything that came next. Through college applications and job interviews and every other space where she'd have to prove her legitimacy to people who should have simply accepted it. Through moments of doubt and accusation and assumption. Through the exhausting, endless work of existing in a world that questioned her presence before celebrating it. She'd handle it all the same way she'd handled the grocery store. With composure. With patience. With truth. And with the quiet knowledge that dignity doesn't need defense, it just needs presence. If you're still here, if you watched this story all the way through, then you already know. This wasn't just about a $50 bill. This wasn't just about a grocery store confrontation. This was about something bigger. Something that happens every single day to girls like Aaliyah. Girls who are questioned before they're heard. Doubted before they're believed. Assumed guilty before they're proven innocent. Girls who have to carry the weight of other people's assumptions while still showing up, still standing firm, still refusing to shrink. Girls who are overlooked, underestimated, and quietly powerful. This channel exists for them. For their stories. For the moments when they stood strong and the world finally caught up. For the truth that dignity doesn't need volume, it just needs witnesses. And if their stories matter to you, if Aaliyah's composure inspired something in you, if you believe these girls deserve to be seen, heard, celebrated, then staying connected isn't just about content. It's about standing with them. It's about saying, I see you. I hear you. You matter. Because girls like Aaliyah exist everywhere. In your city. In your neighborhood. Maybe in your own family. And their stories, their quiet, powerful, dignified stories, deserve to be told. So if you're still here, if something in this touched you, if you believe that justice doesn't always need to be loud to be real, then don't let this be the last time you hear these stories. Subscribe. Not because I'm asking, but because girls like Aaliyah deserve witnesses. And maybe, just maybe, you're one of them. These stories will keep coming. Stories of girls who stood firm when the world tried to push them down. Girls who chose composure over chaos. Girls who let truth speak for itself. Girls who prove that the quietest voices can carry the most weight. And if you stay, you'll hear them all. You'll witness their moments. You'll celebrate their strength. You'll learn, just like Aaliyah did, that dignity is a choice, composure is power, And truth doesn't need volume. It just needs time. And people willing to stand in it. So stay. Be a witness. Be part of the community that believes these girls matter. Because they do. Every single one of them. And their stories? They're just getting started. Word count, 700 words total series word count, 6,000 words.